So just to welcome you to our carbon capture and storage webinar, we're going to be discussing whether carbon capture and storage is a green solution or a climate disaster. And we're delighted to be co-hosting this webinar with Friends of the Earth Scotland, Corporate Europe Observatory and the Centre for International Environmental Law. And just a few housekeeping things, that if you're not speaking, it would be great if you could keep yourself on mute so that there's no background noise. Please feel free to use the chat box to ask questions at any point. And if you have any problems with tech, you're very welcome to send me a direct message or to send Henna a message. And if you suddenly find you lose your internet connection and you're trying to get back in, you can email us at biofuelwatch@gmail.com and we'll make sure that you can get back in. And Henna is recording our webinar tonight so that people who can't be with us can see it. So you're welcome to keep your videos on or off. And we're hoping that our speaker from Friends of the Earth Scotland will be able to join us quite soon. They're having a few internet problems, but we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Pascoe Sabido from Corporate Europe Observatory, by Almuth Ernsting from Biofuelwatch, and by Nikki Reich from the Centre for International Environmental Law. And maybe, Pascoe, would you like to say a little word of hello and a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, brilliant. Hi, so my name is Pascoe Sabido from Corporate Europe Observatory. We work on trying to expose corporate lobbying. In short, I specifically work on, I guess, for the last 6 or 7 years, the oil and gas industry, looking at sort of what the oil and gas lobby is up to, what are its plans.
We're also going to have a discussion about how we can take action, and it's particularly important because in just a couple of weeks' time, the UN climate talks are coming to the UK and to Scotland. And it's never been more urgent for us to take climate action because we are seeing the climate crisis getting worse all around the world. Just this year, we've seen terrible wildfires in California, horrific flooding, Arctic ice melting, and the fossil fuel companies and other companies who are most responsible for causing the climate crisis are making very impressive sounding promises that they will be net zero by 2050, whilst they're continuing their core business and expanding their core business, which is the extraction and burning of fossil fuels and also burning wood in power stations. And July 2021 was the hottest month ever on record. And one of the key ways that some of these companies are claiming that they can take climate action is through carbon capture and storage, which involves power stations, in theory, capturing emissions from CO2 before they reach the atmosphere. And then the theory is that these CO2 emissions will travel along a pipeline and they'll be stored either underground or in the sea. And according to supporters of carbon capture and storage, this is a key way for us to meet our climate goals. I'm going to share a video just now to give us a bit more information about what's actually involved in carbon capture and storage.
Hello, I'm from the Australian Government with an important announcement as we enter the next stage of the climate crisis. Massive fires, massive floods, massive bull. As things fall apart and calls grow for us to urgently reduce our emissions, we've come up with a PR campaign, technology, that makes us look like climate heroes whilst doing sweet nada. Introducing carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture and storage, or CCS, is a complex mining process whereby fossil fuel companies inject donations into the of politicians to delay climate action and let them keep making the ching-ching. CCS entails 2 key stages: capture and storage. In the capture phase, also known as state capture, fossil fuel interests infiltrate your government at every level so that we'll ignore scientists and keep approving new coal and gas projects. But don't worry, in the storage phase, we pay those fossil fuel companies billions of dollars to bury their emissions underground. Does it work? Absolutely. Those companies store the billions of dollars deep down in their bank accounts where no tax officer can reach them. What's that? Do they store the carbon? Yeah, nah. CCS has missed every single target we've set for it. Let's take a look. 20 years ago, we told you that by today, CCS would capture 5,000 million tonnes of CO2 per year. Today, the world can barely capture 10, which is so far off target you can't even see it on this graph. And when you remember that our global emissions are 36 billion tonnes each year, even if it had met its target, it would contribute approximately all. We also said there'd be 100 CCS projects running by today. Today, there are only 6, but the biggest one's right here in Australia. So how's it been doing? Well, we gave Chevron $60 million to capture its emissions, and in 2016, it captured all. In 2017, all. In 2018, all. But in 2019, it finally got clogged up by sand. To date, Gorgon has captured only 30% of its target, and that's just its processing emissions. If you include all those released when the gas is finally burned, it captured barely 2%. But hey, Chevron stored 100% of that 60 million you gave them. Capture and storage. And that's just the latest fail.
Here at the Canadian government, we spent about $1 billion to prove CCS works at this power plant, except it proved it doesn't by failing to reach its target every single year, eh? And here at the US government, we said this one would give us clean coal. It was years late, billions over budget, and then gave up because it clean jack, as did this one.
And it's not just the technology that sucks, the economics do too. Because CCS is so expensive that even if it worked, which it doesn't, implementing it would be unprofitable for our mates. Unless, of course, we make you pay for it, which is exactly what we've been doing by blowing $4 billion of your tax dollars on CCS, including these new projects we just approved. And the best part is we're paying for them by diverting funds away from agencies which are meant to subsidise actual climate solutions, like renewables and EVs. So to sum up, we're making you pay fossil fuel companies to reduce emissions by funding a technology that doesn't reduce emissions, with tax dollars that were meant for solutions that do, to benefit companies that pay all tax in the first place. Capture and storage. There is another way to make CCS profitable: enhanced oil recovery. That's when the captured CO2 is used to flush out oil from deposits which would otherwise be too hard to reach. Oil which, once burned, can release more carbon than was captured. You might call that bull, but we call that carbon capture use, which is why we've added a U to CCS, given Santos millions to pull that trick off at Moomba, and called it clean energy. Speaking of bull, have you heard of clean hydrogen? Green hydrogen, the energy source with zero emissions made from renewables and water. Here's clean hydrogen, made with coal or gas, which emits more than if you just burnt the coal or gas in the first place. But don't worry, it's clean, because we'll bury that problem too with CCS. And those are just some of the new technologies we'll be using to avoid taking real climate action. And when you add them to the mix, you can clearly see what we're all about. Australian government. Authorised by the Department for prolonging the fossil fuel era and making you pay for it.
For our first speaker this evening, I'm absolutely delighted that Pascoe Sabido from Corporate Europe Observatory is going to tell us more about carbon capture and storage, and especially about hydrogen. Pascoe is an amazing climate campaigner and researcher, and also very experienced campaigner at COPs. So he can also tell us a little bit about what's likely to happen at COP26. Thank you so much, Pascoe. Lovely to have you here.
Yeah, I work for Corporate Europe Observatory. We do investigative research, and have been working. Yeah, I've been working on sort of the oil and gas industry, as I was saying, for sort of 6-7 years, and that's what really led us into this, because CCS is such a big sort of tool of the oil and gas industry to stop us moving away from fossil fuels and stop tackling climate change. And what we realize is, we look at a lot of lobbying documents. So we look at sort of what letters have been sent. We do like freedom of information requests. And a lot of the freedom information requests over the last few years were all about hydrogen. So I wanted to talk about hydrogen. So last November, if you go to the next slide, please. Last November, we released a report called The Hydrogen Hype, which was really looking into sort of hydrogen and how the fossil fuel industry was behind it and pushing it. And what we saw is, I mean, there's so much PR spin and hype around hydrogen being this like clean fuel. I think it was rather better described in the video than I'm going to manage here. But it's seen as this like really clean fuel, you know, clean hydrogen. Partly hydrogen is seen as the reason it's pushed as clean is when you burn it, water vapor is produced. So rather than it producing CO2, it's water vapor. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to just go into sort of what's the reality and how this links to CCS. If you go to the next slide, please. So yeah, there's a big push from the fossil fuel industry, I think it's worth saying, for a hydrogen economy. So there's some talk about maybe we can use hydrogen for a few really hard to abate sectors in industrial processes where we really can't reduce emissions, and we can use that. But what we're seeing from the fossil fuel industry is a real push for a hydrogen economy. So we want hydrogen in your homes, in your boilers for your heating, hydrogen cars and hydrogen buses, hydrogen for industry, for airplanes, for ships, power generation, energy storage, everything. I mean, hydrogen for breakfast, why not? Like it's gone mad. So they want to replace gas with hydrogen, is the long and the short of it. So this already gives you a bit of an idea of why the gas industry is really keen on it. So the gas industry sees this as a way to decarbonize the economy. And so they're creating hype around hydrogen, a lot of hype. Next slide, please. So then the big question, oh God, you're not gonna be able to see this, but that's fine, I'll describe it. The next question is, how clean is hydrogen really? And I think particularly in the UK, we're hearing a lot around hydrogen. The UK's hydrogen strategy, I work at the Brussels level, looking at what happens in the EU. They've got their own hydrogen strategy. And sort of all these different types of hydrogen are really mixed into one, because it's really clear of being where the emissions come from hydrogen. Why is hydrogen a real problem? And why is the fossil fuel industry so keen on it? Because the carbon footprint is not in the burning of the hydrogen because it creates water vapor, but in the production of it. And so it's worth noting today that in fact, in Europe, less than 1% of hydrogen comes from renewable electricity. So you can see in my little rainbow, the closest bit of the rainbow is the green bit, and that's what's called green hydrogen from renewable electricity, but less than 1% comes from green hydrogen. And more than 95%, or around 95% of hydrogen in Europe today is from gas, using something called steam methane reforming. It's just the process. You don't really need to know about it. Heating up gas into really high temperatures, and then you manage to separate it into carbon and hydrogen, sort of separate methane, which is a CH4. And most of it comes from steam methane reforming. And most of that, 95%, is not with carbon capture and storage. So the emissions go straight into the atmosphere. And that's what's called grey hydrogen. Apologies for these different colors, but that's grey hydrogen. But the fossil fuel industry, and this is, I guess, what comes in. If you go to the next slide, please. The fossil fuel industry, so this is a slide from the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. So they are the oil and gas industry lobby group, basically, the ones who are digging and drilling and transporting gas, so the Shells and the BPs. And what they say is that we can take natural gas, or we call it fossil gas, and by applying carbon capture and storage, the CCS, and applying different techniques, we can remove the carbon and make it clean. And this is the whole thing, that we can move towards clean hydrogen, and they call that blue hydrogen, or we just call it fossil hydrogen. But I mean, this is really important. Next slide, please. Finally, some decent scientifically peer-reviewed research came out to look at how green is blue hydrogen, because we've been saying there's a huge problem with hydrogen, particularly blue hydrogen, in that it's not clean. And this research came out by Cornell University, and it shows the carbon footprint of blue hydrogen is only around 10% better than grey hydrogen, as in only 10% better than hydrogen produced from gas with no CCS. And the main reason for that is from methane leakages. So whilst capturing CO2 is a different topic that, in fact, one of our speakers who was not able to make it was going to talk about, a lot of the emissions from hydrogen from gas come from the life cycle of gas, come from methane leakages. When you drill and transport for gas, lots of it escapes. And methane is worse for the climate than coal. In fact, it's more than 100 times worse for global warming, heating up the climate, than CO2 if we take it over like a 10-year period. So methane is in fact a really powerful greenhouse gas. And when it leaks, when you're sort of drilling for it and transporting it, it causes some serious climate warming. So what we see is, in fact, I love this statistic, but if we were going to use hydrogen instead of heating industrial processes and stuff, what this study shows is that blue hydrogen, this clean hydrogen, has a bigger footprint than just using coal or gas. I mean, that's mad. That in fact, this whole like, we're going to clean this up and use this clean fuel has a bigger carbon footprint, bigger life cycle than just using fossil gas or coal. And it's worth pointing out, no CCS plants, hydrogen CCS plants currently exist in the UK, but we are building them. So it's worth pointing this out. In the Northeast, Equinor, the sort of Norwegian oil and gas company, has one. SSE, the Scottish, Southern Scottish Electric, is also building one. And so they claim that they're going to capture loads of CO2. They claim that they're going to be really, really efficient, but because you can use the different types of CO2 processes. But as I said, the emissions are not just from what's captured when you're creating the hydrogen, is from that life cycle. So this is why you should be very wary of their of what they're saying. Next slide, please. I realize I'm running out of time. So maybe this will be my last slide. And I just want to sort of underline the difference between hydrogen from like renewable electricity. From the plan is you build some additional renewable electricity next to where you want to be creating the hydrogen, next to where you want to use the hydrogen, and you have like a small closed circuit. That's the sort of, I guess, some uses which would be ideal. But the big difference between green and blue hydrogen is the infrastructure, particularly when we're talking about climate change, and we're talking about lock-in. For fossil hydrogen, so for blue or grey hydrogen, you need fossil fuel infrastructure. It makes obviously perfect sense. You need to keep on extracting more fossil fuels, more fossil gas. You need more gas pipelines. And we're seeing, I work at the EU level, as I said, we're seeing this as justification. The whole hydrogen hype is justification to build more fossil gas pipelines, which one day will be hydrogen ready. And in the meantime, we'll just carry on ramping up production of fossil gas. I'll skip my other little point that was going to happen. And then, of course, so you've got the fossil fuel infrastructure. And let's be very clear, what we're seeing, like fracked gas in the US, in Argentina, what we're seeing in the Niger Delta, this has huge social and environmental consequences as well, with communities being displaced from where they live, having their livelihoods ruined. This isn't just a CO2 issue. You know, the having blue hydrogen and fossil fuel infrastructure means continuing the whole model of extractivism that destroys not just the climate, but local environments and communities. But with blue hydrogen and CCS, of course, you need the CCS, you need the carbon infrastructure too. And that's really important. So you've got your fossil fuel infrastructure and then additional CO2 infrastructure, both onshore and offshore, meaning new pipelines. I think Nikki is going to talk more about it. You need storage facilities, etc. And we're seeing this now. The EU and the UK are going very big on blue hydrogen, thanks to lobbying from the gas industry. Initially, the EU was just looking at green hydrogen. The UK is now, in its strategy, gives equal weight to green and blue hydrogen. So a lot of lobbying has led to this. And so all of this blue hydrogen is going to need CO2 transport facilities and storage. And so now we're seeing public subsidies going into that, going to new CO2 pipelines, new CO2 storage, and they're getting a lot of political support. And once you build this stuff, it costs a lot of money, you're going to be locked in. The business case for moving away from it is going to be very difficult. You've had a lot of investments go in, and there needs to be guaranteed return on investment. So it's really tricky. And in fact, one of the sponsors of COP26, National Grid, is building this infrastructure in the northeast of the UK at the moment. So one to be wary of. And so just maybe to say, governments at the moment are saying blue hydrogen is this transition fuel from, we're going to go from blue hydrogen to green hydrogen, move away from fossil fuels. But I think it's worth bearing in mind, we've heard this transition argument before. Fossil gas itself was supposed to be a transition towards renewable electricity. And what we're seeing now, we've seen over the last few years, the gas industry saying, oh no, gas is a destination fuel because we've got CCS, which obviously is not working. So this is the same thing. We're locking in something with an argument that's a transition fuel and not being able to then move away from it. So maybe just last slide, just to prove that it's not me saying it. This is the Vice President of Shell saying, Shell is behind green hydrogen. Shell is in fact involved in many green hydrogen projects. But what Shell is saying, along with Equinor, is because we're going to have the whole economy needing hydrogen, we're not going to have enough green hydrogen anyway. You're not going to have enough renewable electricity when you're trying to decarbonize your economy. So you're still going to need blue hydrogen, which means you're still going to need all the infrastructure. You're still going to need failed CCS. You're still going to be extracting fossil fuels. And this is the bet being made by industry, is that if we get enough demand for hydrogen, then the green hydrogen will never be able to cover it, and we'll still need fossil hydrogen. So this is the industry's big ploy that we're seeing. I'm going to stop there as I've gone over my time. Apologies, there was a few other things to say, but I can maybe come on. Yeah, this was that last slide was just the chair of the UK's hydrogen lobby quit after the UK released its plan because he realized that blue hydrogen was just propping up the fossil fuel industry and not tackling climate change. So anyway, it's for another time for questions, maybe later. Apologies, I've gone over time.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Pascoe. We've had a couple of questions in the chat box. One of the questions was asking about why is nuclear energy being called renewable in the green hydrogen explanation? This person has heard of solar PV used for electrolysis to make green hydrogen, but not nuclear, which also isn't renewable.
Very quickly indeed. So in our rainbow, in fact, nuclear is called either purple or yellow, depending who you talk to. So it wouldn't be green hydrogen, because green hydrogen is supposed to be from renewable electricity. But what we're seeing is it's important to say, the way green hydrogen is produced is through electrolysis. So running a current through water. But where does that electricity come from is a really key thing. So what we're seeing now is a big push to have electricity coming from the grid. So if you've got a coal grid, even if you're using electrolysis, your hydrogen will be based on coal. In France, they're really pushing for a lot of electrolysis to be based on nuclear energy, and they're calling it green. And this needs to be called out because it is not green, it's nuclear energy.
Amazing, thank you so much. And we've also had a question mentioning a paper that says blue hydrogen could be as environmentally friendly as green hydrogen.
So I said that again, it could be as environmentally friendly.
Yes, could be as clean as green hydrogen, taking fabrication into account.
I'd have to disagree with that. I mean, it depends what we call clean. I mean, this is what industry is saying. Of course, it's clean, depends on our definitions. And if you work for Equinor, of course, it's clean. But no, I mean, you saw the research on the blue hydrogen has a bigger carbon footprint, well, 10% less than grey hydrogen without CCS. So no, I mean, if you look at life cycles, you have to look at blue hydrogen's life cycle as well. I don't think green hydrogen has anywhere near that life cycle. So yeah, I'm not. I would say no, it's not.
Thank you so much. And I think Nikki also has a point.
Yeah, just to flag that to whomever had made that comment, that I also dropped in the chat in response. There was an analysis done by someone named Michael Barnard, who actually looked at those two studies side by side and validated that the Haworth and Jacobson study was actually stronger, the analysis, and was based on sufficiently conservative assumptions that their analysis of the ultimate impacts and their conclusion that so-called blue hydrogen, fossil hydrogen plus CCS, is actually dirtier than burning the fossil fuels themselves. So I would encourage people to look at that piece. I certainly can't do it justice in summarizing it, but there was a two-part piece that did a really careful and close analysis of precisely those two papers that the person is raising.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and a massive thank you, Pascoe, for your wonderful presentation. We'll have time for more questions and discussion next in a little bit, but next I'm delighted to welcome Almuth Ernsting from Biofuelwatch. Almuth is the co-founder and one of the directors of Biofuelwatch and does incredible research into biomass burning and also bioenergy with carbon capture and storage from burning wood. Almuth, would you like to say a little introduction to yourself?
Yes, hi. Yes, well, I think Sally already introduced me. I'm actually wondering, so unfortunately our presenter from Friends of the Earth Scotland had an internet breakdown. So I've been suggesting that before I start my own presentation, I'm going to give you a little quick overview of what is actually planned with carbon capture and storage or proposed in the UK. Although I haven't prepared that, I'm just going to show you 3 pictures from the internet. And then you can see I lead into speaking about BECCS because that is part of it. So let me try and share Yes, here we go. So just for those of you sort of looking at the UK, so we've got really ambitious proposals going through, partly being in the early stages of the planning processes in the UK, as far as the pipelines are concerned. And you're going to have a presentation about pipelines later from our next speaker. So just very, very brief. So the idea is that you've got potentially all those different, and this doesn't mean that they are all very advanced or mature or absolutely realistic plans, but this idea that there's going to be loads and loads of different places where CO2 is going to be captured, primarily almost all of it related to natural gas. So the vast majority related to natural gas. Few things here about waste incineration and the biomass plant that hasn't even opened yet, that I'll see a little bit more as more unlikely. But yeah, so the majority of this is certainly hydrogen related, gas related. And so this is the T side side of it, arm of it. So both are in the northeast, so further north, and then further, a little bit further in Yorkshire, a little bit further south. Oh no, here, this is it. You've got those proposals for additional ones. Again, you can see yeah, this is ammonia production, hydrogen again, but also what we are mainly the fossil fuel industry, but also Drax, which is a big biomass project, and I will tell you lots about that. And just to say, so the ultimate plan, if this ever comes off, so at least on paper, is, oh no, sorry, that wasn't it, to have those two pipes, so all those onshore pipelines link up, go to the to storage site off the coast of so quite far out from Hull. So let me start with my own presentation now. So that was my own presentation is about the false promise of BECCS. Okay, right. For those of you who don't know what BECCS means, so bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, I found this really nice graphic in a report by ActionAid. They call it how BECCS works in theory, but not in reality. So it's the idea that you, that trees or other, I would say crops potentially as well, absorb carbon dioxide. They are then harvested, well, which for trees is a nice euphemism for clear cut or logged, and the biomass is then burnt, and the emissions are then supposedly captured and stored in the ground, supposedly forever. So that is a theory of what BECCS what BECCS is meant to be about. Oh no, hold on. Like this. So I have a quick slide. I'll go through this really quickly, and we're going to send around the presentation, certainly mine later or afterwards, so you can read in detail. But I thought it was quite interesting. It's actually taken from an article in the magazine Carbon Brief about where this whole idea came from. And the interesting thing is, so this whole idea started off in the years 2000, 2001. It's when the first people started to just think about BECCS. And the interesting thing is that, the people who were thinking about it first. So the first one was somebody studying ways for the Swedish pulp and paper industry to benefit from carbon trading. Then you had, who thought, maybe, we can get like double carbon credits if you bury the carbon from biomass, extra money. Then you had David Keith, who is a chief proponent of various geoengineering technologies, then an advisor to General Electric AS on carbon business. Hold on, sorry, I can't, now I've got my, sorry, that was, sorry, that was James Rhodes, it was the advisor. David Keith is, so he's a key proponent of geoengineering. He now runs his own, as director of his own company, investing not in BECCS, but in direct air capture. And then you had one researcher. And so it's quite interesting that these three of them started very much, really startup business ideas around the car, about car. Two of them, carbon trading carbon business people, one really into geoengineering, and then one researcher. And then from about 2005, BECCS got included into, oops, slide type here, BECCS got included into modeling for emissions pathway scenarios by the eventually, so by certainly by 2010, by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. And that kind of means that it got included into those climate models, not because it had proven to work, but basically as a placeholder for something that somehow gets rid of carbon from the atmosphere, right? So I thought it's quite interesting background. No. Here we go. What are the problems? Very brief. Well, if you wanted to do this on a scale where you think it's going to make an impact on the climate, you're going to need absolutely vast quantities of woods and crops, large-scale land use change, and or intensification of logging. What I mean by large-scale land use change is, we were speaking of areas the size of India or bigger for this, right? Really, really incredible. It relies on the false idea that biomass energy is inherently carbon neutral. I'll go back to that in a moment. And the technology development will require billions and billions of dollars and euros in public funding. To get to this would require that in order to become commercially viable, to get to the commercial stages. And that is money that will directly compete with the need to spend it on things that work, such as insulating our homes or investing in efficiency, investing in genuine low carbon renewable energy. Now, the other big problem with BECCS is, well, with CCS in general is, so this is a picture, just a draw of an industry, I think, drawing of what carbon capture looks like. This is all the equipment you just need, apart from this power plant in the corner, that you need for actually capturing and then compressing the carbon dioxide. And as you can imagine from this picture, it takes a lot of energy. It's a really energy-intensive process. How much? Hard to say, but we knew very little real-world data published from the coal and other plants doing this. I mean, well, if I say coal plant, there's only one commercial-scale coal plant unit doing this at the moment. It's Boundary Dam in Canada. And last time, one time that we actually managed to get reports from them, they were using almost 1/3 of the whole plant's energy just for the capture and storage. In other words, you're going to burn a lot more wood, a lot more crops for less energy. And keep in mind that even the most efficient biomass power station for electricity has less than 40% efficiency. So if you burn 100 trees, the energy in 6 of the trees goes straight up this chimney or straight up the cooling towers as waste as uncaptured heat. So makes it 1/3 less efficient still. One thing, I won't go into this, is the only thing that is currently working on BECCS, it has been shown, is capturing CO2 from ethanol fermentation. Now that's almost pure CO2 stream, just CO2 and water. So much easier, much cheaper, but you can't possibly call it carbon negative because the refinery is doing that. Well, the one refinery that actually does that in a US federal government supported CCS project actually emits more CO2 from fossil fuel burning to run the refinery than is captured and stored. So yeah, that's the only thing that kind of works technically. Now, let's look at Drax, because that is the big proposal at the moment. For those of you, most of you will be familiar with Drax, I imagine. They are the world's largest wood burning. They operate the world's largest wood burning plant in Yorkshire. Drax is burning more wood every year than the UK produces in total for all purposes annually. And they're getting virtually all of that wood pellets from overseas. So these are all pictures from British Columbia, from the southeastern USA, and from Estonia, 3 of the big three of the main sourcing regions for drugs, showing how they how many or a big share of those pellets is being sourced, from mature trees in biodiverse forests that are routinely clear cut in those areas. So much for drugs being a solution to climate change. Yeah, you can make up your own mind from those pictures. Now, what's Drax's proposal? Basically, Drax is proposing to develop the world's first commercial carbon capture scheme based on burning biomass, i.e. not on ethanol fermentation. They want to scale up carbon capture from up to 100 tons a year to 4 million tons by 2027, rising to 8 million tons by 2030. But that depends on lots more public subsidies, saying that Drax is already getting over 2.1 million pounds in subsidies right now every single day. But yeah, BECCS will cost even more. Okay, what's the experience with BECCS so far? And I would say there's no, just to say why solely focusing on Drax here is because there's nobody else proposing to do what Drax is proposing to do in any realistic way. But is it realistic? So in 2019-20, Drax collaborated with a startup company called C-Capture. They were trying to capture 1 ton of carbon dioxide a day. It didn't work. They currently, since then, have been ongoing 2 feasibility studies with 2 startup companies. Again, not actually doing things, just thinking, writing and exploring and doing studies. Neither of those companies has any track record for anything of delivering anything. And those they want to utilize Drax's CO2 for different purposes. They don't involve actually sequestering it. One wants to feed it to fish, or wants to make protein feed for fish using carbon dioxide. And yeah, and right now they've got a partnership, or since autumn last year, they've had a partnership with Mitsubishi to basically product test a new amine solvent. So amine solvent is what you need to do the actual cap to scrub the CO2 out of the gases, flue gases. So they've been testing that with a maximum of 300 kilograms of CO2 per day. Not a single gram of CO2 has been stored or utilized. And Drax, in a question in a response to a question at a consultation event, said, "Our BECCS assumptions for energy are not based on trials. They will be based on our detailed design work," which means, and what they're saying is not based on any real world experience. Now, what does it mean? Does it mean that they can do it by 2027? Is there any possibility? Is it just us thinking, being dismissive of the possibility? Well, here is, here's one, what we found, what we call a graphic of how technologies are scaled up, new technologies are being developed. And you have basically going from an unproven concept idea 0 to full commercial application. Now, Drax has reached the start of, I would say, of stage 2, which is between 4 and 5, small-scale prototype tested in intended environment. Is it large-scale, 300 kilos a day? No idea. Somewhere between 4 and 5. But they want to move to the full commercial application stage 9 in the next 6 years, simply bypassing the 3 really important vital stages in between. So in other words, that has never happened for any new technology of this type, to our knowledge anywhere. You can't go from 4, 5 to 9 without slowly, gradually scaling up and testing. In other words, we do not think that there's any realistic prospect of Drax achieving that, but our concerns are about the money, the subsidies they want. And I should have said earlier, the Drax's current subsidies of the 2.1 million, they actually end in 2027. So they want to make sure that the money continues using, based on the idea of BECCS somehow. So that is really all I had on BECCS, but I thought there's something else really important to say. Last week, I think it was last week or the week before, There was a new report that I would really recommend people look at by Zero Waste Europe, who've been looking at, the same kind of talk and ideas put forward by waste incineration companies who are now trying to similarly paint themselves as having the potential to go carbon negative, even though a lot of the waste you burn is actually from fossil fuels, fossil fuel-based plastics. They are now vying for they also want money and subsidies. This is especially at the moment a small issue in the EU countries and outside the UK. This is one example of one in Copenhagen that really would like some money. So, it's worth having a look at the Zero Waste Europe website. Interesting. So, in conclusion, it's very easy to make a case that we need to suck CO2 from the air, and this is my favorite little creatures. The idea, or sci-fi idea of actually, we can make a real case, quite seriously, a real case that we absolutely need creatures or anything or extraterrestrials like here to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. That part of the argument is very easy to make. Actually coming up with a viable proposal is something totally different. And the idea that we can burn vast quantities of woods or crops, store the CO2 they contain, and thereby ultimately cool the planet, or reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, that is actually, as much science fiction as, this is funny drawing in my view. And yep. I shall stop. How do I unshare?
Thank you so much, Almuth. That was wonderful. We've had a question from Roger, and Roger's question is, with COP26 coming this year, do you agree that it's important that everyone who cares about climate change and loss of biodiversity should write personally to their political representatives and make sure they know their views?
Yeah, I mean, definitely writing to political representatives is a great idea. And I think, we've got a joint petition on against the current subsidies for drugs, so we can send some links round, or will send some links round to everybody who's been at the event afterwards. But yes, definitely sharing, your concerns with representatives is always a great idea.
Thank you so much. We've also had a question from Patrick in the chat box, who's saying that's wonderful information and watchdogging, I'm convinced. What I'm hearing though is that there's a strategy for burying CO2 about 1 meter deep through bionic genetically modified plants. And a lead scientist, Joanne Chory of the San Diego-based Salk Institute, is getting positive publicity for this. Is this more hype than reality?
I'm not totally sure about this particular proposal. Let me answer that in the chat afterwards. I'll have to double check. I'll do it in the chat, okay?
Thank you. And one final question. How likely do you think it is that the UK government sticks with Drax's BECCS proposal? And do you think the government will give them the 30 billion that they're asking for?
I have no idea, but we are very concerned that this should not happen. We think, it's really, really important to prevent that from happening. This is money that if it is given, will lead to continued pressure on and increased logging of biodiverse forests, which is making climate change worse, which is making the biodiversity extinction crisis far worse. And at the same time, taking money away from the things which we need to spend it on. So yeah, I can't say, I don't know what's in the mind of the government, but it's really important to work together to try and prevent that from happening.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your brilliant presentation and great answers. And I'm delighted now to welcome our third speaker, Nikki Reich from the Centre for International Environmental Law. And Nikki, would you like to say a brief introduction?
Sure, I will do so, and then I will attempt to share my screen without a technical snafu. My name is Nikki Reich, and I'm the director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law. And as my accent probably gives away, I am based in the United States, in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to talk today about an aspect of CCS development that doesn't get sufficient attention, and that's the environmental health and safety risks that it introduces, and particularly those associated with the transportation and storage of compressed CO2. So before I turn to that central focus of the discussion today on transportation and storage risks, I do want to take a step back just to make clear that there are other significant adverse impacts associated with CCS deployment, particularly for communities living on the fence line of refineries, power stations, plastic production facilities, and other industrial facilities that proponents want to equip with CCS, because tacking on carbon capture technology to those polluting facilities prolongs their life, and with it prolongs exposure to the many different forms of toxins and pollutants that come from those industrial facilities beyond carbon dioxide. And because of something that a prior speaker mentioned, the energy penalty associated with carbon capture and storage, that is the additional fuel needed to power the carbon capture process itself, facilities equipped with CCS may burn more fuel to produce the same amount of output. And as a result, even if they were successful at capturing the carbon dioxide, which we have seen from experience to date that they are not, they might also increase air pollution, such as fine particulate matter and other gases to which surrounding communities are exposed. So there are also other issues which I won't focus on today, but that Almuth referenced about the chemical solvents that are needed for capturing CO2. And while that's beyond the scope of what I'll discuss, I do want to flag that that's a really important environmental health and safety issue that really doesn't get coverage in the media attention and policy discussions about carbon capture and storage. So without further ado, if you remember nothing else from this presentation, please remember this video, which I will.
This video shows a rupture of a buried, dense phase carbon dioxide pipeline. The experiment was conducted in the safe environment of the DNVGL Spade Adam Testing and Research Centre to assess the consequences of such ruptures in terms of mass outflow, crater formation and dense gas dispersion. The viewer should note that the extent of the visible plume does not necessarily represent the extent of the dense gas hazard.
So what you've just seen was a controlled rupture of a dense phase CO2 pipeline. It was conducted in the UK, as the narrator announced, in an uninhabited area far from any residences or commercial zones. And the pipeline in this experiment was 8 inches in diameter, which is far smaller than the pipelines envisioned for CO2 transportation over any significant distance in CCS proposals, including the Teesside project that developers contemplate. The onshore pipeline and nearshore section of the CO2 export pipeline in the Teesside project will have a diameter of up to 800 millimeters, which is over 2 feet. The volume of compressed CO2 in a pipeline increases rapidly with the pipeline diameter. That is to say, an unplanned rupture of an actual CO2 pipeline in a CCS project could be much worse, both because the pipeline used for CCS would likely be larger and contain more compressed gas, and because, as the proposals under discussion today, the Humber low carbon pipelines and the net zero Teesside project reflect, CO2 pipelines are increasingly being proposed to be built in populated areas. Proponents of CCS often state that CO2 pipelines are safe, and most such descriptions are really based on generalizations from limited experience to date with CO2 pipelines, almost all of it in the context of their use for enhanced oil recovery, which is the production of oil, pumping more oil out of the ground. The technology in that context has actually been around for a really long time. It's just not been used for any climate benefit. Where pipelines, in that context, typically transport CO2 for very short distances from a source to reinjection site, or some of those assertions that it's very safe are based on extrapolating from oil and gas pipeline data. But neither of those sources paint an accurate picture of the safety risks associated with CO2 pipelines at the scale and distance envisioned in CCS proposals. There are risks that CCS introduces. These risks are really largely under or unaddressed. Transporting, and I'm going to come to this now, but transporting compressed CO2 over long distances through pipelines is potentially very dangerous. There are risks of pipeline corrosion, leakage, rupture, as we just saw. And at high concentrations, CO2 is toxic, and it might be mixed with other contaminants that would exacerbate the risk of corrosion and toxicity. Accidents have happened and are pretty much inevitable if we expand at the rate that proponents are seeking the build out. So I wanted to point out a few ways that piping compressed CO2, particularly over long distances, is not the same as piping fossil gas. First, CO2 is a dense gas, denser than air, and it's transported in a supercritical state. That means at very high pressures that can be from 2 to 10 times as high as those used in natural gas pipelines. So it requires really careful pressure management. Those high pressures also require thicker pipelines. So you can't just repurpose oil and gas pipelines or necessarily use the same corridors as some proponents have suggested. CO2 is also an asphyxiant. That is, it's toxic at high concentrations and can even be fatal, as we've seen in some natural contexts, like the Limnic eruption that happened in Cameroon in 1986, where massive volumes of carbon dioxide killed over 1,700 people. Most safety studies and systems for oil and gas pipelines, including assessments for the safe minimum distances around pipelines, they assume the risk with the pipeline is related to ignition. But in the case of CO2 pipelines, that risk is really related to inhalation, at least the risk to people and the danger to their livelihoods. And there are very different conditions that affect how gas would behave when it's released or what threat it would pose. Those dynamics are not the same at all. But there's really too little data to date on CO2 exposure, failure dynamics, and accordingly, the safety measures necessary to prevent and respond to them. Nonetheless, we have seen the few examples of what can happen with pipeline rupture raise really serious concerns about the implications of building more such infrastructure in populous areas. Nonetheless, proponents of CCS are still planning to build out pipeline systems in areas that put communities at risk. So I recognize that the focus of today's webinar is on CCS development in the UK, but I wanted to provide some perspective on the push for CCS build out in the US, not just because that's where I'm based and because it's an epicenter, but really because it's an epicenter of the CCS build out and really reflects some of the potential scale and risks. So at present, there's about 5,000 miles or 8,000 kilometers of CO2 pipelines in the US, and they're largely concentrated in oil and gas fields where they're used for enhanced oil recovery. But some CCS proponents imagine expanding that in the name of deploying carbon capture at scale, 12 times over, building 60,000 miles of such pipelines. And you see here in this map, the green areas are areas depicted as storage sites or locations, and the network of purple pipelines just shows the expanse of the areas that would be are proposed to be home to this network and web of pipelines. In a study in December in 2020, a Princeton study that was funded in part by the oil industry calls for this massive pipeline system to be developed, which would really require in the building of these massive trunks and corridors that could have pipelines with diameters as large as 4 feet, according to some proposals, twice the size of one we know ruptured last year, and I'll talk about in a moment. And to carry enough CO2 to have any impact on the climate, as proponents advocate, the size of the required pipeline system would be massive, and by some accounts would be larger than the existing petroleum pipeline system that's taken over 100 years to build in the United States. And this map here just shows how extensive that web is. So it's not only unrealistic, but one important note is what's missing from all of these maps here, and what I'm about to turn to in the UK context, what's missing is where are the people? these maps don't reflect the people and communities and the demographics of the areas that will be burdened by the CCS infrastructure and the risks. So turning to the, oh, I'm sorry, that's the quote I was just pulling out about that map there, which just appeared on the slide. Turning to the UK, and we've heard a bit about these proposed projects here, there are similar dynamics beginning to emerge with the targeting of industrial areas for CCS build out. And what's conspicuously absent from this map here and the following maps of the two sites under contemplation near Hull in the Humber area and in the Teesside area, excuse me, are people. We don't see any of the population density. So I wanted to just do a little exercise and take a look at what it would look like to overlay population on these projections of where the pipelines could be built in the Humber project. You'll see here, and this is imperfect, but this is an old map I found, and no doubt the population has grown beyond the size reflected here, but the darkest areas are areas of highest population density. And if that area outlined in red is where the project is proposed to be located, and you see with this overlay here that the pipeline route, which is in a sort of light gray between the orange squares, runs right through some rather densely populated areas that are conveniently erased from the map that we see when the project is discussed. This is the same. This is a close-up of the Teesside project area and some of the sites that it proposes to draw CO2 from. And there isn't an indication here of how populous some of these corridors may be, but it raises some of the same environmental justice issues that we are attuned to in the US when these projects are built through areas that are typically marginalized communities that are already overburdened by toxic exposure to industrial facilities. So remember that video at the beginning. What do we know about what happens when a compressed CO2 pipeline ruptures in the vicinity of people in residential areas? So we have one example from last year, unfortunately, in Mississippi in February of 2020, a CO2 pipeline carrying captured carbon to oil fields for EOR ruptured. And in that experience, which was characterized as the first known instance of an outdoor mass exposure to piped CO2 gas anywhere in the world, approximately 300 people were evacuated, 49 people were treated at hospital. And first responders described finding people in a zombie-like state, people foaming at the mouth and unconscious. The health effects of exposure to concentrated CO2 are significant. And this is just a chart from the US Environmental Protection Agency. I'm sure a similar such chart exists from UK authorities about how the effects on body functions and health vary with the concentration of carbon dioxide and the amount of time to which people are exposed to that concentration. So it could range from headaches if there's mild exposure at low levels of concentration to loss of control of one's body, unconsciousness, coma, and death at greater levels. And this is some of the same information presented in a different way to show how those impacts increase with the concentration of CO2. And as I'll talk about briefly, and I know I'm coming up to the end of time already, as I'll mention briefly, what are some of the factors that contribute to whether these risks materialize or make this risk real, is that the presence of impurities in the CO2 stream can increase the possibility of corrosion and rupture of a pipeline. And this chart here reflects how the risk of fatality increases, the 1% risk of fatality in proximity to a rupture increases from within 60 meters of the site to well over 2 kilometers, almost 3 kilometers, if there's a presence of hydrogen sulfide in the CO2. And that's one of the factors that contributed to the injuries and the impacts in Satartia in Mississippi. So highlighting just a few of the risks associated with the transport of CO2 and the factors that contribute to the possibilities of those accidents materializing. CO2 streams can contain impurities such as hydrogen sulfide, as I said, and sulfur dioxide, especially when they come from industrial plants. And there's really a lack of quality specifications on those CO2 streams. And corrosion, importantly, corrosion due to water is the chief cause of failure of pipelines. And so there's a need constantly to ensure that those impurities and water don't interact with the CO2. There also, as we saw in that video, the real strong risk of ductile running fractures, which basically blow open pipelines for long distances and expand the area of potential impact. So all of these unique factors about the risks of CO2 pipelines really raise questions about whether engineering specifications and safety standards are appropriate, and the siting rules that apply to pipelines currently, and whether there's really first responder capacity to address the risks that arise. I don't have much time. I know I'm out of time now. I wanted to touch a little bit on the risks that are associated with storage as well as transport. So these are not just risks that arise in piping the compressed CO2, but actually injecting it into the ground. A lot of the risks to which there's been more attention have to do with proposed injection into saline aquifers or onshore sites that can result in displacement of methane, that can result in induced seismic activity, that can result in a number of other such impacts, including the need to constantly manage the pressure in those sites. So displacing water or brine. Ooh, that is a new image. I'm not sure what that was. I don't know if you all saw that, but my computer scrambled. That can really introduce new risks associated with the toxic water or brine that is coming out of those sites. Offshore leaks, and I mentioned offshore because the projects under contemplation in the UK do propose to inject CO2 offshore. And those leaks, one thing that's important to note is that detecting leaks in offshore pipelines and storage sites are much more difficult to detect and repair. And we know that there's already insufficient attention to and monitoring of methane leakage from offshore oil and gas production. So there's a significant risk that that would be the same with offshore storage of CO2. So just to assume that it doesn't pose risk is unwise and indeed reckless. And here I had just pulled out a couple lines from the environmental statements from the Leaside project that really raise questions about how seriously the developers and the government are taking these risks, based on indications that they think the combined effects study only needs to address risk during the construction phase, not necessarily during operation, and that they're delaying until a later time the preparation of major accident prevention documents. So I've run out of time, well over, I'm sure, and I'm sorry if I wasn't seeing your reminder about that. I did have, if there's time in the discussion, I have a couple slides or comments regarding hydrogen and the risks associated with the transport of hydrogen. So beyond it not being a climate solution, but I think I will save those, and I will leave you there. And for more information on CCS and CL's work on these issues, please check out our page on carbon capture and storage. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki. That was wonderful. We've had a question from Abdul about the kind of material that is used for these pipelines. Can you tell us about what kind of material, other than the 8-inch diameter, are pipelines? Are they thermoplastic or specially reinforced, or are they traditional metal?
That's a very good question. They are definitely special and reinforced metals that have to be able to withstand much more pressure. And there are different studies about the reaction of different treated steel and its fragility to the state change between compressed CO2 gas when it is depressurized and turns into, from a liquid-like state to gas. It creates very cold conditions and can create solid ice particles, and that also can compromise the integrity of the pipeline materials. So there are different materials under discussion and testing. I would hold off on specifying exactly which are most widely used now, just because I don't want to misspeak, but certainly the materials I've been hearing about are not at all plastic, but indeed heavy reinforced metals, but that are treated to withstand the intense heightened pressure under which CO2 is transported.
Thank you so much. We've also had a comment about another terrible accident in 1986 at Lake Neos in the Cameroons. And it was a limnic eruption in a lake which released CO2 that killed over 1,700 people. Is that an accident that you've come across?
Yeah, and thanks for whoever had raised that. Yeah, I mentioned it in passing. It was, a natural phenomenon, and it's not, I think studies have not made clear exactly what caused it, but there is a phenomenon whereby disturbances in the ground or the area under a body of water can release stored or dissolved carbon dioxide and can shift it around in a sudden way that releases a huge cloud or plume of carbon dioxide. And that's what happened in Cameroon in 1986, and nearby nearly 2,000 people and well over 3,000 animals and livestock were killed, were asphyxiated. And so it does underscore, well, that, that's a different context from what it would be like if there were a rupture of a pipeline. It just does underscore that statements to the effect that carbon dioxide is not a toxic substance or is not a dangerous or hazardous material in the way that it's being proposed to be used doesn't accord with experience to date, and really needs to be given a much closer look. And these issues just much more systemically raised in coverage by the media and then by policymakers. I think it's imperative on all of us who are in this advocacy space to raise questions about the environmental justice impacts of the proposed projects. In whose backyards and communities are these pipelines and facilities going to be built? Which polluting facilities will be prolonged? Where are the measures being taken to ensure that these supposed solutions that we've seen fail time and again aren't doing far more harm than good?
Thank you so much. We've also had a question about CO2 pipes. On a sea floor, would a ruptured CO2 pipe implode, and what consequences could that have at either end, for example, on a platform at the onshore pumping station?
Again, that's an excellent question. I will disclose the fact that I am a lawyer by training and not an engineer, so I can't extemporaneously elaborate on studies I haven't conducted myself or done, but I do know there have been a lot of studies about the effects of saturating, marine environments or the ocean with higher concentrations of CO2 that not only could have an impact on marine life, but also on the ability on acidification in the ocean and the ability of the ocean to in fact absorb CO2 as it does currently. So I think the big concern with offshore is that it hasn't received as much attention, certainly by many of the leading proponents and advocates of CCS in the US who've been focused more onshore. But I think that the real concern with offshore storage, or one of many real concerns, and particularly at extreme depths, is that it's very difficult to detect and very difficult to repair such leaks when they do occur. And so I'm not sure exactly what the dynamics would be with the weight and pressure of the water, whether that would cause implosion as opposed to explosion, because I think the pressure environment is quite different, obviously, in water than in air. But I do think that the release might just induce absorption into, or dissolution, of the CO2 into the water, which could have other deleterious effects.
Thank you so much. And now we're moving into a discussion time, so we can ask questions for all three speakers. And we have a comment, maybe more for Almuth. There are currently proposals for a waste incinerator in Flixborough, which may be proposed to be subject to CCS. Can you say anything more about the threat of waste incinerators with CCS?
No, but I mean, unless Shlomo put it in, would like to say a few words. I don't know. I mean, I was really just citing the report from Zero Waste Europe.
And Shlomo?
Thank you, Alma. Yes, well, the comment I made about Flixborough was in response to a comment about how people around Hull would remember the accident there, and there was I suppose, implicit assumption that because people would remember it, then they would resist proposals for carbon capture and storage that would affect Flixborough. And I just thought it was germane here. Hopefully there's enough older people in Hull, Humberside who will remember the Flixborough chemical plant. And the answer is yes, they sure do. And I'm working together with them to oppose a proposal for a waste incinerator. And as you can imagine, increasingly, after years of saying that incinerators had no carbon problem when we were saying that they did, suddenly now they're saying that they want loads of government funding for carbon capture and storage because they recognize that they have a terrible carbon problem. So we've made some progress in that sense, But obviously, because we should have an incineration exit strategy, there's no point wasting money on carbon capture and storage for incinerators, because we're looking to move to a circular economy, and incineration, like biomass burning, has no place in a closed loop circular economy. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, yeah.
And we've got a question for Rebecca for all three speakers. I have a question. Are there any circumstances under which you would accept carbon capture and storage? Maybe Pascoe, can we go to you first?
I was worried you were going to ask me about this. Thanks, Rebecca, for the question. I think I'm going to have to turn it on its head slightly, because we get asked this about hydrogen quite a lot as well. You know, I personally am not for green hydrogen, because I think this is not a technical scientific question, it's a political question, because it's what goes with these technologies. And the way I respond about hydrogen is saying, actually, we need to say no to hydrogen. There may be a few small areas where it could be used, and that has to be a democratic decision, and we have to decide what our energy system looks like. But the moment you start saying yes, we have to look at who's saying yes. And for hydrogen, like with CCS, the main uses of it are to perpetuate an economic model and a sort of extractivist model, which props up fossil fuels, which props up really polluting practices, bioenergy burning, like we've seen in Drax. So I think it's really, for me, we have to be very aware of what the political dynamic is, and how do we not legitimize the models of some of these really damaging practices. So I'd have to say no to CCS, and if maybe it is a fudge, but we need to have a democratic conversation and decide what our economy wants to look like and how we move away from these practices. And then we can see at what scale, you know, we need our energy, we need our production of, be it of chemicals, of steel, of all these things, and other practices. But I'd maybe chuck it over to Nikki, because I read a brilliant piece on CL's website that quoted Exxon, where Exxon actually did a study of its own industrial facilities and how whether CCS would be feasible, and actually the majority was no. I think, I can't remember, out of 100, more than 150, only 49 or something were vaguely feasible. And so even industry itself says CCS is not going to be a solution. So I find it's without huge amounts of public subsidies and other things. So I think we need to be very careful of what saying yes to CCS actually means.
Wonderful, thanks so much. And Nikki, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I would strongly support and agree with Pascoe's reframing and approach to answering that question. I think that we often get, it's often the sort of tail wagging the dog, or we're often asked that, oh, well, won't we need CCS or some technology for this last, you know, little bit of a hard to abate set of emissions that can't get, you know, be reduced in any other way. I think that, you know, not number one, that myth that CCS is useful and effective or necessary for industrial decarbonization is far overstated and overblown. And as Pascoe referenced, there was a study that I think it was a Chevron researcher, but who participated in looking at the viability of CCS at industrial sites across the US. And they, you know, reduced down from an initial pool of sites many times over for lots of reasons. First, taking out all of those emissions that could be reduced just by electrifying the grid and actually getting cleaner sources of energy in, and then, you know, taking out those systems where it wasn't economically viable, and left it just a very small fraction of facilities, and most of those not even nearly viable with the massive existing subsidies. So the question really is about politics and about where we need to be putting the action. We shouldn't be making decisions about what technologies to put in place when we still haven't done the work of reducing the vast majority, the 80–90% of emissions that we can reduce by replacing fossil fuels, by halting deforestation, by changing the major causes and sources of emissions. And once we start playing that game, I think we really deflect attention from and, you know, the crucial issues about how we're ushering in a replacement to the fossil era, how we are downsizing and reducing reliance on plastics and agro-industry and the other major sources of emissions across the board. So I think it's quite wrong-headed, and I don't mean that as a critique of the person posing the question, but I think that it's often framed in that way. Yeah, I will happily come back on other questions. There's a number of good questions in the chat, but I'll leave it over to you to.
Thanks so much. And Almuth, how about for BECCS? Are there any circumstances where you think BECCS could be viable?
Well, I will kind of go back to what the other two speakers have said, that I mean, the first thing to see is that actually, you know, the whole technology setting it up. I mean, is we don't have evidence that you can securely store carbon dioxide for long periods. You know, that you know, the very premise of CCS has not been proven. Secondly, if you invest in the infrastructure, you're not speaking of something that you kind of tag on to doing loads of great stuff and then you have like your little CO2 pipeline somewhere. This is stuff that costs billions and billions and billions investment. And clearly we are now, you know, we are seeing, you know, this is at a time when, you know, across Europe or across the UK, many parts of the world, you know, you have actually you know, expansion of wind and solar energy, for example, in many places halted because of lack of support. You know, we've got a huge deficit on, you know, of money going into home insulation, on the things that really save energy. And yeah, I mean, I would start with that. It is really, really wrong to think that we can just throw billions and billions and billions at something that might capture and potentially store, if it really works, you know, what would ultimately be a tiny amount of CO2 overall. Yeah, so I would say it is completely the wrong path. And that's about CCS in general.
Thank you so much. We've had a couple of great questions about the UN climate talks that are coming to Glasgow in a couple of weeks. How will the climate summit at Glasgow deal with CCS? And as far as your speakers are aware, are there any moves at COP26 to try to discourage policymakers from committing to unproven negative emissions technologies like CCS or the burning of biomass as a means of achieving their nationally determined contributions? Maybe Pascoe, would you like to start us off with this one?
Yeah, I love the slight optimism in the question there. In a very simple way, I would say no, in terms of well, where the measures to try and push countries to not go for things like CCS, they're coming from civil society, they're coming from social movements, they're coming from communities on the ground who are facing the impacts. They're not coming from our governments. So at COP26, you're going to have almost very few delegates from the global south, countries where in fact, be it forests are going to be sourced from, and where a lot of the sort of the offsetting things are going to be happening. So we're not going to have, it's going to be a very northern COP with a very northern agenda, global north agenda, sort of not UK north, with sort of the US, the EU really setting an agenda, the UK setting an agenda. And what's behind it as well is sort of private finance. This is going to be the finance COP. And so private finance is also looking to how can it get really involved. And there's going to be, it's happening on the 19th, sort of the Global Investment Summit with Drax. Drax is going to be there sort of showing off its BECCS, its bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, trying to attract funding. And the UK government wants it to attract funding because Drax also wants to export BECCS globally. That's part of its investment plan. It wants to try and export BECCS globally. And it's going to be inside the talks. So we're going to have the big trade associations like the International Emissions Trading Association. It's been there for many years. It brings huge delegations, bigger than most countries. It will bring enough people that are bigger than most countries' delegations. And it's going to be there putting on side events, bringing ministers along to share panels, talking about CCS, talking about carbon markets. Because I think it's important to situate CCS, carbon capture and storage, and bioenergy CCS in this bigger push for the biggest polluters to not cut their emissions. This has been a decades-long fight where we've seen them trying to not cut their emissions and instead offset them or find technology so that they can carry on with business as usual. So CCS is within that, and you're going to have their lobby groups really present, and the likes of the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute is going to be there hosting events. They've been running a whole lot of workshops and build up. So there will be a lot, but resistance to that is going to have to come from civil society, from groups like CEO, like Biofuelwatch, from lawyers like CL, from all of you who are interested in stopping this. Of course, I hear there might also be some industry lobbyists on this webinar, so clearly you have a different view to us. But that's where the sort of resistance is going to come from, because this is, as well as being the finance COP, this is the net zero COP. And net zero is this sort of the overarching umbrella that contains bioenergy, CCS, carbon offsets as a way for these big polluters to carry on. So I'm pretty worried about COP and what's going to happen and the sort of solutions they're going to be pushed. But in just the last bit, in the actual negotiations, they don't mention technologies. You don't mention fossil fuels. You don't mention CCS and these things. So they did have a sort of a special session back in 2014 where they discussed CCS, discussed renewable technology and these other things, but it's they stay quite high level and leave it to sort of national governments. But this is what's being pushed by industry, both in COP26, but let's be really realistic. A lot of the lobbying has happened this year, last year. It's already been happening over the last decades in our national capitals, with a close relationship between these big polluters like Drax and the UK government, means that once the UK government is at COP26, it's already been lobbied, it's already on board. So what happens at COP26 will be the icing on the cake. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Pascoe. Just as we finish, I'm going to highlight some of the things that we can do to take action. So as Pascoe has been telling us, there's a huge injustice at COP26 that the communities around the world who are most impacted by the climate crisis are already suffering the most from it, and many of them are not able to travel to be at COP in person. And the eyes of the world are going to be on COP and the UK, and we really need to take action to try and put pressure on our leaders not to invest in these false solutions like CCS, but to invest in genuine solutions like protecting and restoring our forests and not cutting them down, and stopping investing in fossil fuel companies that are driving the climate crisis. And some of the ways that we can take action are firstly through the climate strikes. There's going to be a huge climate strike on the 5th of November if you're in Glasgow. There's likely to be lots of climate strikes in other places around the world as well in that day. And then a major way we can take action to support communities around the world is by taking part with the COP26 Civil Society Coalition. They are fighting for climate justice, not just at COP, but beyond COP. And there's a major day of action on the 6th of November. This is the Global Day of Action for Climate Justice, and people all around the world are going to be taking part. There's going to be a huge march in London, another huge march in Glasgow, and marches and events all over the world. So it would be brilliant if you could take part in that day of action. And also between the 7th and the 10th of November, there is the People's Summit for Climate Justice. There are going to be incredible sessions on many false solutions, on CCS, Biofuelwatch, Corporate Europe Observatory, Friends of the Earth Scotland are all going to be taking part, and there's so many wonderful sessions. Some of them are going to be in person, but many of them will be online, and it would be great if you could join them. There's also a petition you can sign to kick polluters out of COP26, which is with 350.org. And I'd just like to finish with a quote from Greta Thunberg. "We can still turn this around. It is entirely possible. It will take immediate, drastic annual emissions reductions, but not if things go on like today. Our leaders' intentional lack of action is a betrayal towards all present and future generations. We can no longer let the people in power decide what hope is. Hope is not passive. Hope is not blah, blah, blah. Hope is telling the truth. Hope is taking action, and hope always comes from the people." So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll just go back to that one. These are our contact details for Biofuelwatch, Friends of the Earth Scotland, who sadly couldn't come tonight because of technical issues, Corporate Europe Observatory and CL. And we can share those links. And just, we've got 3 minutes left. So I'd like to invite our three speakers. Would you like to say a 1-minute closing statement? What can we do instead of CCS? What's a genuine solution? Maybe Almuth, would you like to start?
Yeah, well, I would, although you've already, I think, mentioned quite a bit, you know, I mean, I think we kind of on Sally in it, you know, what we really need to do is, you know, take measures to, you know, to phase out fossil fuel burning very, very rapidly, reduce, you know, stop the waste energy, reduce energy use, and then meet the reduced energy demand from the lowest carbon renewable sources we have. And we need to protect our forests, protect our ecosystems, and allow as much restoration of ecosystems as is possible. And one quick remark I would make is that I think it's really important, especially for people who haven't been following the COP, processes for some time, not to put on, not to have high expectations and feel let down by this, because a lot of the, the decisions will not be made at COPs. I mean, the COPs are, they're sadly big greenwashing opportunities and big PR opportunities and big business opportunities very often for big polluters. But a lot of the decisions that will be made, including on CCS infrastructure, for example, about the building of the pipelines, about this whole project, they will be made at the national level. They will be made at the regional level, wherever we are. So preventing bad things. There is a lot, whatever you focus on, of local, local, regional and national action that I believe can make a real difference. And, just to think in the UK, how successful the anti-fracking movement, for example, has been in, over the last decade, I think, it's really important to remember those.
Thank you so much. And Pascoe?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree with everything Almuth says. And I'm sure I'll agree with what Nikki says. So I'm going to try and bring a slightly different angle, which is a campaign we've been working on for the last 5 years since COP21, which is kick big polluters out. Someone in the chat said, who would be left if you kicked out big polluters? Well, who would be left would be our governments, which is quite important. Who would be left would be indigenous people, would be farmers, would be trade unionists, would be social movements who are in there. We are in there if we kicked out big polluters. So this is the campaign we've been running. And this is about how do we, because ultimately climate change it's a political problem, it's an economic problem, but it's a democratic problem. Why are people, we're calling for these changes and they're not happening? Because our governments are in bed with those same industries causing it. So how do we try and remove them? How do we try and make sure that these polluting industries do not have such a grip over policy making that we've seen in the past? And we want to try and learn from the World Health Organization, because actually when the United Nations Framework Convention on Tobacco Control was being drawn up, they realized that the influence of the tobacco industry and the tobacco lobby was holding back ambition. It was holding it through fake science, through revolving doors, through sort of all the sponsorship of events, partnerships, lobbying, everything, you name it. The rule book was written by the tobacco industry. So they introduced a firewall because they realized that the interests of the tobacco industry were irreconcilably and fundamentally against the interest of public health. So this firewall separated the two, and this firewall signed at the UN level then was applied at national level and regional level of every signature. The US, I don't think has signed yet, but most people have. And how can we have such a firewall against the fossil fuel industry and beyond, against polluting industries, to protect climate policy making from these industries, from these clear conflicts of interest? If you're trying to burn down the table, you shouldn't have a seat at it. And this is fundamental. If we want to have these other changes that we want to see elsewhere, we need to make sure that we can reclaim policy making and stop our decision makers being in bed with the polluting industries.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pascoe. And Nikki?
Well, seeing as those were brilliant words and we're over time, I definitely love that. If you're burning down the table, you shouldn't have a seat at it. I think really a lot of what's been said here about the essential importance of looking upstream and saying, until we turn off the tap of pollution, until we turn off the fossil fuel tap and the money tap that is funding it and that is benefiting from it, we're not going to solve the problem. And until we really not just give a sort of rhetorical nod to frontline communities, but until we actually center and listen to what frontline communities and fence line communities who are living with the impacts of climate change, who are bearing the burdens of the extraction and polluting industries that are causing the crisis, tell us what the solutions are, what they need, and focus our energies there, we're not going to find an equitable solution either. So we really need to look upstream, and we need to look to leaders in frontline communities, indigenous peoples and local communities who are fighting for their own rights and for our collective future. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to our wonderful speakers tonight, to Pascoe Sabido from Corporate Europe Observatory, to Nikki Reich from Ciel, and to Almuth Ernsting from Biofuelwatch. You've all been incredible, and a huge thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. It's been fantastic. I'm sorry if we didn't get through all of the questions. Thank you very much for your fantastic questions. We'll take a note of them, and it's been absolutely wonderful to be here with you tonight. Thank you very much.